The lawyer's office was suffocating. It smelled of old leather and polished mahogany, a sterile masculine scent so unlike the familiar aroma of paper and lemon verbena that filled my own home, the home that had been mine and Robert's for 43 years. I sat stiffly in a wingback chair that seemed to swallow me whole, my hands clasped tightly around my purse. Grief was still a thick fog in my mind, and this meeting, the reading of my late husband's will, felt like just another cruel formality in a long, painful process. I expected it to be simple. We had no children. Our lives were intertwined as seamlessly as the threads of an old tapestry. Everything we had built together. Everything was ours. Mr. Davies, a man with a face as dry and brittle as old parchment, cleared his throat and began to read from the document. His voice was a monotone drone, devoid of any sympathy. He read through the initial articles concerning the payment of debts and funeral expenses. I barely listened, my mind drifting to the image of Robert in his favorite armchair, a history book open in his lap, the reading glasses perched on his nose. And to my beloved wife Eleanor Vance, Mr. Davies's voice cut through my reverie, pulling me back to the cold, airless room. I bequeath all of my personal effects, including my library of books, my clothing, jewelry, and all personal photographs and correspondence. I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. His books, of course. It was a small, sad comfort. Mr. Davies took a sip of water, then continued to the next article, the one that would address the bulk of the estate. Article 4. All remaining assets of my estate, both real and personal, of whatsoever kind and wheresoever situate, including all financial accounts, stocks, bonds, retirement funds, and all real estate properties, specifically the residence located at 451 Chestnut Lane, Philadelphia. I give, devise, and bequeath, wholly and without condition to the street. Jude's Children's Foundation. The words hung in the air, sharp and meaningless, like a sentence in a foreign language. I must have misheard. I looked at Mr. Davies, expecting him to correct himself. He simply looked back at me over the top of his spectacles, his expression blank. I don't understand, I stammered. St. Jude's, the research hospital in Memphis? We sent a small donation every Christmas, but— No, Mrs. Vance, the lawyer interrupted, his tone clinical. This is not the St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. This is a private nonprofit, the St. Jude's Children's Foundation, registered here in Pennsylvania. A cold dread, sharp and swift, pierced through the fog of my grief. A private foundation? One I had never heard of? Robert was a meticulous man. He discussed everything with me. A decision this monumental— It was impossible. There has to be a mistake, I insisted, my voice rising with the first flicker of panic. Our home, our savings, that was our future. Our retirement. It was for us. The will is perfectly clear, and it is legally ironclad, Mr. Davies said, folding his hands on his desk. His duty was to the document, not to the weeping woman in front of him. My instructions are to liquidate all assets and transfer the proceeds to the foundation. You will have 90 days to vacate the premises. 90 days. 90 days to leave the home that held every memory I cherished. 90 days before the life Robert and I had so carefully built would be sold off and given to a nameless, faceless charity. I stood up, my legs unsteady, the room tilting slightly. I was being evicted from my own life by a ghost, by the very man who had spent half a century promising to keep me safe. I walked out of that office in a daze, the cold Philadelphia air hitting me like a physical blow. Robert, my gentle, loving, protective Robert. My rock, my fortress. How could the man who built a fortress around me to shield me from the world's cruelty be the very one to unlock the gate, push me out into the cold, and leave me with nothing but the clothes on my back and the shattering realization that I had been married to a stranger? A stranger? The word echoed in my head, but it didn't feel right. The man I had buried last week was not a stranger. I knew the cadence of his speech, the weight of his hand in mine, the specific way he sighed when he was tired. I knew Robert. Or, at the very least, I knew the man who had built the fortress. And that fortress, I knew, was very real. Its foundation had been laid 43 years ago, forged in the fires of a single, brutal night that cleaved my life into a definitive before and a fractured after. Before that night, I was a different woman, I was 25, a graduate student in literature, confident and unbound. I saw the world as a library of stories waiting to be read. After that night, the world became a single, terrifying text written in a language of fear I could not unlearn. The attack didn't just break my body, it shattered my trust in the world, in other people, in my own judgment. Every shadow held a monster. Every friendly face could be a mask. The library of the world had slammed shut, and I was trapped in the dark. I was dating Robert then, a brilliant, gentle young history professor. In the immediate aftermath, I had expected him to leave. I was broken, tainted, a ghost of the woman he had known. But he did not leave. He did the opposite. He stepped into the ruins of my life and, with a quiet, unwavering devotion, began to build. He became my shield. When the phone rang, I would flinch, terrified it was a reporter or a detective with more questions. So, Robert began to screen all my calls. When the thought of the crowded aisles of a grocery store sent me into a panic attack, he simply started doing all the shopping, never making me feel like a burden. For the first few years of our marriage, he would walk through our small apartment every single night before we went to bed, checking the lock on the door, the latches on the windows, a quiet, reassuring ritual that told me I was safe. A ritual he never stopped for 43 years. He built a wall around me not of brick and mortar, but of his own steadfast presence. When well-meaning friends or family would ask intrusive questions, trying to understand what had happened, Robert would step in. "Ellie doesn't need to talk about that," he would say, his voice gentle but laced with immovable steel. "Let's talk about something else." He never pushed me to get over it. He simply created a space where I didn't have to. He absorbed the sharp edges of the world so that I could live in a place of softness and peace. I remember one night, about a year after we were married, I woke up screaming from a nightmare. The details of the dream were already fading, but the terror was cold and real. He held me, his arms a warm, solid anchor in the darkness, and he rocked me until the shaking stopped. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just held me and whispered a vow, a promise that would become the central pillar of our entire existence. "I'm here, Ellie," he said, his voice a low rumble against my ear. "Nothing is ever going to get through me to you again. I swear it. This is your safe harbor. I am your safe harbor." And I believed him. I let him be my harbor. I needed it to survive. I let him build the walls high, and I lived gratefully within them, never realizing that the one person a fortress can't protect you from is the architect himself. He had kept his promise for 43 years. He had been my shield, my guardian, my rock. Every part of my healing was intertwined with him. And the heart of that fortress, the physical manifestation of his promise to keep me safe, was the little brick house on Chestnut Lane. It was more than just a house. It was a promise made tangible, the gospel of our shared life written in mortar and wood. I remember the day we first saw it. It wasn't grand or new. It was a modest, 70-year-old row house with a slightly crooked porch and shutters that needed a fresh coat of paint. But it had a soul. Sunlight poured through a large bay window in the living room, and a magnificent old oak tree stood sentinel in the small, overgrown backyard. "This is it, Ellie," Robert had said, his voice full of a quiet conviction. "This is where we can be safe." That safety came at a price, one we paid willingly, together. To scrape together the down payment, Robert sold his beloved vintage Triumph convertible, a car he had painstakingly restored in college. I cashed in the savings bonds my grandmother had left for my future. We poured every penny we had and everything we could borrow into securing that home. From that day forward, our shared goal, our singular financial obsession, was to own it outright. Robert, my quiet history professor, despised the idea of being indebted to anyone. "A man's home is his castle, Ellie," he would say, "and a king doesn't pay a banker for the right to live in his own keep." Our great adventure wasn't traveling the world. It was the slow, steady quest to burn the mortgage. Our lives became a study in careful frugality. Our academic friends took sabbaticals in Paris and Rome. We spent our summers reglazing the old wooden windows and planting a vegetable garden in the backyard to save on groceries. Other faculty members drove new cars. Robert drove the same sturdy Ford sedan for 15 years, learning how to change the oil and replace the spark plugs himself from a library book. My wardrobe was filled with simple, classic pieces that I mended myself, not because I didn't love beautiful things, but because I loved the idea of our security more. Every extra dollar we saved, every small windfall, went straight toward the mortgage principal. It was a joyful sacrifice. We had a chart taped to the refrigerator, a grid of 360 squares, one for each mortgage payment. Every time we sent in a check, we'd let ourselves share a single cupcake from the corner bakery, and, with great ceremony, I would fill in another square with a red marker. It was our ritual, our quiet celebration of inching closer to our dream. The day we made the final payment was one of the proudest of our lives. When the paid-in-full notice arrived from the bank, Robert held it up as if it were a sacred text. He had it professionally framed, and it hung on the wall of his study until the day he died. That piece of paper was his triumph. It was the proof that he had kept his vow. He had provided a true, untouchable harbor. That house wasn't an asset to us, it was our life's work. Every bookshelf Robert built, every flower bed I tended, every coat of paint we rolled onto the walls was a testament to our partnership. It was the place where the nightmares finally faded. It was the solid ground beneath my feet. And now, a lawyer in a cold, sterile office was telling me it was no longer mine. The security of that house, the quiet peace within its walls, became the compass by which I navigated the rest of my life. It shaped every decision I made, including the one to quietly lay my own ambitions to rest on the altar of our shared tranquility. Before the attack, my professional life was on a steep upward trajectory. I was a passionate researcher with a master's degree in library science, and my professors in graduate school had encouraged me to pursue a doctorate. My dream was to become a curator of rare books at a university, a life spent among first editions and delicate aging manuscripts. The world of academia, with its rigorous debates and intellectual challenges, had thrilled me. After the attack, that world felt impossibly daunting. The thought of standing before a lecture hall of students, or navigating the sharp-elbowed politics of a university department, filled me with a quiet, persistent dread. I still loved books, the order and the wisdom they held, so I found a job at a local branch of the city library. It was a peaceful life. About 10 years into our marriage, an opportunity arose. The head of our branch was retiring, and I was her hand-picked successor. It would have meant a significant raise, a prestigious title, and a chance to truly shape a community institution. It also would have meant long hours, public speaking, citywide meetings, and managing a large, complicated staff. It meant engaging with the world in a way I had spent a decade trying to avoid. I remember laying the offer letter on the dining room table. Robert read it, and his face lit up with a genuine, unselfish pride. "Ellie, this is incredible," he said, taking my hands. "You've earned this. You would be a wonderful director." He never once suggested I turn it down. If anything, he gently encouraged me to take it. "You are the smartest woman I know," he told me. "Don't let the ghosts of the past cheat you out of your future." But I was the one who was afraid. I looked at the life the promotion offered, a life of stress, politics, and public exposure, and I compared it to the life I had. A life of quiet routines, of retreating at 5 o'clock every evening to the safety of our fortress on Chestnut Lane, to the calm, steady presence of my husband. I chose the fortress. I politely declined the promotion and remained a reference librarian until the day I retired. I never once regretted that choice. In my mind, it was my most important contribution to our marriage. Robert was the protector, the one who built and maintained the physical walls of our sanctuary. My role was to be the keeper of its peace. I sacrificed a career so that our home could be free of the stress and ambition of the outside world. It was a willing exchange, my ambition for our tranquility. I believed we were a team, working in tandem, making equal, though different, sacrifices for the same shared goal, a life of unbreachable peace. Now, sitting in the profound silence of the home I was about to lose, I see the devastating flaw in that belief. I see that our sacrifices were not equal. While I was giving up my future to maintain our shared present, he was secretly making plans for a future that did not include me at all. I had been the only one paying the price for a peace that was, In the end, nothing but a beautiful, heartbreaking lie. That devastating truth did not drown me. It woke something up. For 43 years, I had been the quiet keeper of a peaceful home. I had willingly traded my own ambitions for a life of gentle routine and carefully guarded tranquility. But with that life now set for demolition, the librarian within me, the researcher who had been dormant for decades, began to stir. The grief was still a raw physical ache, but now it had a companion, a cold, methodical anger. I had one last, desperate query to research, and its name was the St. Jude's Children's Foundation. I knew I couldn't do it alone. The fortress walls had been breached, and I needed an ally. I called the only person I knew who would meet my quiet grief with a righteous fury, my friend Grace. Grace was a fellow book club member, a retired journalist who saw the world not as a library of stories, but as a collection of leads to be investigated. She was sharp, a little cynical, and fiercely loyal. She arrived at Chestnut Lane less than an hour later, a thermos of strong coffee in one hand and a look of grim determination on her face. I told her everything, my voice steady as I recounted the scene in the lawyer's office. Grace listened, her expression darkening with every word. When I finished, she slammed her coffee thermos down on the kitchen table. "He did what?" she exclaimed, her voice vibrating with the outrage I was still too numb to feel. "Sainted Robert? The man who looked at you like you were the only thing holding the sun in the sky? I swear, Ellie, I never trust a man that perfect. There's always something hiding in the attic." Her anger was a gift. It validated my own swirling feelings of betrayal and made them real. For the first time since Robert's death, I didn't feel entirely alone. We turned my polished dining room table, the site of so many quiet, happy dinners, into an impromptu investigation headquarters. Grace opened her laptop, and I, drawing on the skills that had been my profession for 40 years, began to search. The first red flag was the most obvious. A Google search for St. Jude's Children's Foundation in Pennsylvania yielded absolutely nothing. No website, no Facebook page, no news articles about charity galas or fundraising drives, nothing. A foundation substantial enough to inherit an entire estate, including a prime piece of Philadelphia real estate, should have had some kind of digital footprint. This one was a ghost. Next, I guided Grace to the online databases I knew from my library days, sites that tracked all registered 501(c)(3) nonprofit organizations. We found it, but the listing was a skeleton. It had a name, a date of incorporation 5 years ago, and a mailing address. There was no mission statement, no public financial disclosures, no list of board members. It was a hollow shell. The final, damning clue was the address itself. Grace plugged it into Google Maps. It wasn't an office building in downtown Philly. It wasn't even a small suite in a suburban office park. The address was for a UPS store in a tired-looking strip mall in King of Prussia, an hour outside the city. "It's a P.O. Box, Ellie," Grace said, turning the laptop to show me the grainy image of the storefront, wedged between a nail salon and a pizza parlor. Legitimate million-dollar charities do not operate out of a mailbox. We stared at the screen, the ugly truth settling between us. This wasn't a strange, heartfelt donation to an obscure but noble cause. This was a sham, a fiction. Robert hadn't given our life savings away, he had hidden it. "It's a dead end," Grace said, the fury in her voice returning. "Whoever is behind this is hiding behind a wall of corporate anonymity. The only person on earth who knows who holds the key to that mailbox is that stone-faced lawyer of his." I looked at the picture of the strip mall, then at the framed photo of Robert on the mantelpiece, his kind, scholarly smile now looking like a cruel smirk. My resolve hardened. "Then," I said, my voice quiet but laced with a strength I hadn't heard in years, "it's time to remind Mr. Davies that a grieving widow is one thing. A librarian on a mission is something else entirely." My mission began the next morning. Fueled by Grace's righteous indignation and my own cold anger, we were no longer two retirees sharing coffee and sorrow. We had a purpose. Grace, drawing on her years as a journalist, knew exactly how to apply pressure. She spent the morning drafting a formal, intimidating letter to Mr. Davies. It was a masterpiece of legal bluffing, filled with phrases like fiduciary duty, beneficiary rights. and thinly veiled threats of filing a formal complaint with the Pennsylvania Bar Association for his refusal to provide transparent information. We weren't asking anymore. We were demanding the name and contact information of the director of the St. Jude's Children's Foundation. We sent it via certified mail. The wait was agonizing. For 2 days, every time the phone rang, I jumped. Every car that passed the house seemed to be carrying a response. Finally, on the 3rd day, a crisp envelope from the law firm arrived. It was thin, which I took as a bad sign. Grace came over immediately. We sat at the kitchen table, the letter lying between us like an unexploded bomb. My hands trembled as I slid a butter knife under the flap. "Who do you think it is?" I whispered, my mind racing through horrifying possibilities. A secret lover he'd kept for decades? A criminal associate from a past I never knew existed? I braced myself for the sterile shock of a stranger's name, a final, concrete piece of evidence that my husband had lived a double life. I unfolded the single sheet of paper. It was a short, curt response from Mr. Davies, stating that, in the interest of compliance, he was providing the name of the Foundation's sole registered officer. I scanned down the page, past the legal jargon, to the single-typed line at the bottom. Director, Mr. David Vance. The air rushed out of my lungs. It was a punch to the gut, so much more painful and intimate than any stranger's name could ever be. David Vance, Robert's younger brother, the family's black sheep, a man who had drifted through life on a cloud of bad ideas and even worse investments. David was a perpetual project, a source of endless frustration for Robert, who had spent 40 years bailing him out of one financial mess after another. He was the charming, irresponsible brother Robert loved, but certainly never respected. He was the very last person on earth my meticulous, cautious husband would ever have trusted with $100, let alone his entire life's savings. And suddenly, the ugly picture became devastatingly clear. This wasn't a sophisticated scam for a secret life. This was something far more pathetic and grubby. Robert must have been in some kind of terrible, secret trouble. A debt, a failed investment he was too proud to tell me about. And in his desperation, he had turned to the one person he knew would help him hide the money, his screw-up brother. They had cooked up this shabby little scheme, a fake charity, to shield our assets from creditors, leaving me in the dark. The betrayal was no longer a grand, mysterious act. It was a cheap, back-alley deal made between brothers, at my expense. The image of my husband, my sainted, protective Robert, was replaced by that of a common liar, a hypocrite, secretly colluding with the one man he always professed to disdain. He hadn't been protecting me from the world. He had been protecting his own pride, using our home, my home, as the stakes in his secret, final gamble. The last of my sorrow withered and died, replaced by something glacial and hard. The ghost of my husband was one thing. I couldn't confront a memory. But this accomplice, this shabby, flesh-and-blood ghost, had a name and an address. David Vance. I looked at Grace, my eyes dry. "Get your car keys," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I'm going to pay my brother-in-law a visit." The drive to David's apartment in South Philly was a silent, 40-minute procession of fury. Grace navigated the traffic with a grim focus, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. I stared out the window at the passing city, but I didn't see the streets or the buildings. I saw my life, a carefully constructed narrative, being torn apart, page by page. The loving sister-in-law I had played for 40 years, the one who always brought an extra casserole to family dinners and never failed to send David a birthday card with a $20 bill tucked inside, was gone. In her place was a prosecutor, a woman marching toward an interrogation with a heart full of ice. David lived in a third-floor walk-up in a tired-looking brick building. The hallway smelled of stale cooking oil and dampness. Everything about the place screamed of financial desperation, which only served to confirm my theory. He was the perfect, pathetic accomplice. He opened the door, and his face, already etched with a baseline of weary anxiety, fell when he saw me. He looked smaller and more rumpled than I'd ever seen him, dressed in a faded t-shirt and worn-out jeans. There was no sign of a man who had just come into a massive inheritance, but I was blind to that. I saw only guilt. "Ellie," he stammered. "What are you doing here?" I pushed past him into his cluttered, stuffy apartment, Grace following behind me like a silent bodyguard. "I don't have time for pleasantries, David," I said, my voice as cold and hard as I could make it. "I've been to the lawyer. I know about the St. Jude's Children's Foundation." I watched his face. A flicker of panic, of pure terror, crossed his eyes before he quickly looked away. It was all the confirmation I needed. "I know it's a shell company," I continued, ticking off the points of my indictment. "I know its address is a P.O. box in a strip mall. And I know that Robert, my husband, your brother, named you as its sole director." I let that hang in the air. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He just stood there, wringing his hands, a cornered animal. "So, you're going to tell me right now where the money is?" I demanded. What was the secret he was hiding that was so terrible he had to steal my life to cover it up? Was it a gambling debt? Did he have another family stashed away somewhere? "Tell me, David. Tell me what pathetic, sordid little secret my husband died with." The words poured out of me, a torrent of grief that had finally hardened into pure, unadulterated contempt. The man I had loved and respected, the sainted professor, was a common criminal. The great love story of my life had been nothing but a cheap, shabby con, and this sad little man was his partner. David finally looked at me, his eyes swimming with a desperate, painful emotion I couldn't or wouldn't decipher. "Ellie, you don't understand," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "It's not what you think. I can't. I promised him I would never tell you." "You promised him?" I laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You promised him you'd help him make his own wife homeless?" "No!" he cried out, taking a step toward me. "He did it to protect you." "I swear to God, Ellie, every single thing he did it to protect you. You have to believe that." "Protect me?" The rage finally boiled over. "He threw me away. He stole my home, my future, my past, and he put it all in your hands. Your hands, David. The most irresponsible man he ever knew. You call that protection? I call it a lie. I call it theft." I walked out of his dingy apartment building with a bitter taste in my mouth, the taste of cheap excuses and squalid family betrayal. I had the truth. Robert was a coward and David was his lackey. It was as simple and as ugly as that. And yet, as Grace drove me home through the fading afternoon light, I couldn't shake the image of my brother-in-law's eyes. They weren't the triumphant, greedy eyes of a successful thief. They were the eyes of a pallbearer at a funeral, burdened by a weight far heavier than money. The anger I had felt in David's apartment should have been satisfying. It was a clean, simple rage, a sturdy wall to hide behind. Robert was a liar. David was his accomplice, and I was the righteous victim. The story was ugly, but it was simple. But the image of my brother-in-law's haunted, sorrowful eyes was like a dissonant chord in a familiar song, and it refused to leave my mind. The memory of his words, "He did it to protect you," played on a loop, a nonsensical refrain that clashed with the straightforward narrative of greed I had constructed. "He's just a bad liar, Ellie," Grace insisted over the phone that evening, her voice a comforting dose of cynicism. Of course he looked miserable. "He's a spineless man who just got caught helping his brother rob his sister-in-law. He's trying to paint himself as some noble, long-suffering secret keeper instead of the pathetic accomplice he is. Don't let him get in your head." I told her she was right. I tried to believe it myself. I focused on the eviction notice sitting on my kitchen counter, a ticking clock counting down the 90 days I had left in my own life. I thought of the 43 years of shared history being liquidated and handed over to a man who couldn't even keep his own lights on. The anger was easy. It was the confusion that was unbearable. That night, alone in the house that felt more like a museum every day, I couldn't sleep. The librarian in me, the part of my brain that sorts, categorizes, and looks for patterns, took over. I sat in the dark and I listed the facts as I knew them. Fact: the foundation was a shell. Fact: David Vance, a man with a history of financial irresponsibility, was its director. Fact: my entire estate was now legally his to control. These facts all supported one conclusion: a shabby, desperate financial crime. But then there was the anomaly, the data point that didn't fit. David's reaction. A triumphant thief does not look like a man carrying the weight of the world. A greedy con man does not plead with you to believe in his co-conspirator's noble intentions. The pieces didn't fit. The story had a hole in it. Frustrated, I tried to force the narrative back into its simple, ugly box. Grace was right. I was overthinking it. I was letting a pathetic man's amateur theatrics confuse me. But to prove it to myself, I needed more evidence. If Robert had been in secret financial trouble, as my theory suggested, there had to be a paper trail. A man as meticulous as my husband couldn't hide a massive debt without leaving a single trace. A new cold purpose settled over me. I was no longer just a victim waiting for the eviction date. I was a researcher again. My fortress had been breached, my life's work was in ruins, but Robert had left behind one thing I still had full access to: his archive, his study. I pushed open the door to his study, the room where I had last seen him, asleep forever in his favorite armchair. It was no longer the sanctuary of a beloved scholar or the crime scene of a common thief. It was a library of secrets, and I, the librarian, was going to find the evidence to prove my case. I wasn't looking for love letters or hidden treasures. I was looking for letters from creditors, records of failed investments, the desperate hidden paperwork of a man living a lie. I was looking for a motive I could finally understand. I had no idea that what I was about to find would not support my theory, but would instead destroy my entire understanding of the man I had married. My understanding of Robert began to unravel not in his financial records, but in his academic ones. I started my search methodically, like any good librarian would, in the filing cabinet where he kept 40 years of tax returns and bank statements. I was looking for the paper trail of his desperation, a loan application, a threatening letter from a creditor, a statement from a secret credit card. I spent hours sifting through manila folders, the scent of old paper filling the quiet study. What I found was the first profound crack in my theory. There was nothing. No hidden debt, no desperate financial moves. In fact, our finances were even more meticulously organized and stable than I had realized. He had been a careful, prudent investor. We were, on paper, the model of financial security. Robert was the absolute opposite of a man in secret trouble. The simple, ugly story of a man hiding from debt was wrong, and if that story was wrong, I was left with a terrifying, gaping void. The confusion was worse than the anger. Frustrated, I turned my attention to the walls of books, his life's great passion. I told myself I should start packing them, as the will so cruelly dictated. I began pulling them from the shelves, the familiar weight of his history tomes in my hands. But as I worked, I started to notice a strange pattern. Tucked between a biography of Ulysses S. Grant and a dense volume on the Ottoman Empire, I found a book titled The Body Keeps the Score. A few shelves down, nestled among his Civil War histories, were the psychology of adoption and legal frameworks for anonymous trusts. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. These were not the books of a history professor. They were not the books of a man hiding a financial secret. This was the library of a man wrestling with something else entirely, something deep and hidden and painful. My search gained a new, frantic energy. I abandoned the bookshelves and moved to the cardboard boxes in the closet, the ones filled with his old academic papers, lecture notes, and research articles. I didn't know what I was looking for anymore. I only knew that the story was far stranger than I could have imagined. In a box labeled American History Seminar, I found a folder that felt thicker than the others. It wasn't filled with lecture notes. It was packed with photocopied articles from medical journals, psychology publications, and law reviews, collected and annotated in his neat, scholarly hand. The titles made the hair on my arms stand up. Neonatal Adoption Protocols in Cases of Maternal Trauma, Establishing Irrevocable Paternal Trusts for Minors. Long-term developmental outcomes for children of assault survivors, the psychological ramifications of intergenerational trauma. The articles were dated. The oldest was from 42 years ago, just a year after my attack. The most recent was from just 3 years ago. This wasn't a recent plot. This was not a whim. This was a secret he had been tending to, studying, and obsessing over for nearly our entire marriage. The meticulous, exhaustive nature of the research was so perfectly, characteristically, Robert. But the subject, it was from another universe, a universe that revolved around a child that, in our 43 years together, had never once existed. The papers slipped from my fingers, scattering across the Persian rug. The anger was gone, burned away by a cold, creeping dread. This wasn't the work of a thief. This was the work of a haunted man. The foundation, the money, the cruel eviction, it was all a symptom of something else, a much deeper and more tragic story. I knew then that the final answer wouldn't be in a research paper. It would be in a place where he kept his most absolute secrets. My eyes fell upon the small, framed photo of us on his desk, the one from our 10th anniversary. And I remembered the one place I hadn't looked, the bank safe deposit box he'd opened that year, the one he always told me was just for the really important papers. The really important papers. The phrase, so mundane and reassuring for decades, now echoed in my mind with a sinister, unspoken weight. The key, I remembered, was in the top drawer of his mahogany desk, kept in a small velvet pouch with his grandfather's silver pocket watch. I had found it dozens of times over the years when looking for a pen, and never gave it a second thought. Now, it felt like the most important object in the world. The next morning, with Grace driving, we went to the old downtown branch of Philadelphia Fidelity Bank. The building itself was a fortress of granite and marble, a temple dedicated to secrets and security. The journey down to the vault in a small, silent elevator felt like a descent into the underworld. The air grew cold and still. In the vault, a young bank officer with a practiced, somber expression led us through the quiet, echoing chamber, the walls lined with thousands of identical metal doors. He used his key, and then I used mine. The lock turned with a heavy, satisfying thud, and he pulled a long, thin, surprisingly heavy metal box from the wall and placed it on a small table in a private viewing booth. He closed the curtain behind him, leaving Grace and me alone in the sterile, silent space. For a long moment, I just stared at the box. Everything I thought I knew, every memory I held sacred, was about to be challenged by whatever lay inside. A part of me, the part that had lived so long in the safety of the fortress, wanted to leave it sealed. It wanted to walk away and live with the ugly, simple story of a financial betrayal, rather than face a truth that might be infinitely more monstrous. "Ellie," Grace said softly, placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. "You've come this far. You can't turn back now." She was right. I took a deep breath, my fingers finding the small latch on the box. What could be inside? Adoption papers? The deed to a secret property? A stack of letters from a secret lover? My mind braced for a mountain of complicated, damning evidence. I lifted the lid. The box was empty. Or, rather, it was almost empty. The sight was so contrary to my expectations that it took my brain a moment to process it. There were no stacks of documents, no stock certificates, no hidden bundles of cash. The vast majority of the green felt-lined interior was bare. In the very center of the box, lying stark and solitary, was a single, thick, cream-colored manila envelope. It was sealed on the back, not with glue, but with a disc of dark red wax, impressed with the head of a Roman Stoic, a seal from a set I had given him for his birthday 20 years ago. It was a touch so formal, so archaic, so Robert. And on the front, in his familiar, neat scholarly script, was my name. Eleanor, not Ellie. Not the affectionate nickname he had used every day for 43 years. Eleanor, the formal name he used only for the most serious of documents, the name on our marriage license, the name on the deed to our home. Below it, he had written a date. It was the same day he had signed the will. I knew, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, that this was the end of the search. This was the answer. The bizarre will, the ghost foundation, his brother's strange grief, the decades of secret research. It wasn't a trail of clues. It was a meticulously constructed path, designed by a historian's mind, to lead me to this single, final destination. This was his last lecture, and I was his only student. Grace reached across the small table and took my hand. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice a whisper. I looked at the envelope, at my own formal name written in my dead husband's hand. He had built a labyrinth of lies and grief, and this was the secret at its heart. "No," I whispered, my fingers finally closing around the thick, heavy paper. "But I have to be." I broke the seal. The red wax seal crumbled under my thumb, the sound a tiny, final crackle that seemed to echo in the tomb-like silence of the viewing room. Inside the envelope were 10 pages of thick, cream-colored stationery, filled from top to bottom with Robert's familiar, steady script. My hands trembled as I unfolded them. This was his voice, reaching out from beyond the grave. I took a shallow, unsteady breath and began to read. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I have failed. My greatest hope was that you would live out your days in the peace we built together and never have to know the contents of this letter. My leaving you the house and our savings was my plan A. This complicated, cruel alternative was the final, desperate measure of a dying man terrified of leaving a story unfinished. I must begin by asking for your forgiveness, though I know I have not earned it." My eyes scanned the first page, my mind still bracing for a confession of debt or infidelity. What I found instead was a story that ripped a hole in the fabric of my reality. He wrote of the year after the attack. He described my state of mind with a historian's painful precision, my dissociation, my night terrors, my inability to be in a crowded room. He called me a beautiful, fragile ghost, and he wrote of his own desperate fear that the slightest wrong move would shatter me forever. And then came the words that stopped my heart. "2 months after the attack, we discovered you were pregnant. You were on so much medication for the anxiety, so lost in the fog of your trauma, that you were not fully aware. But I was. And I was terrified. I let out a small, involuntary gasp. My hand flew to my stomach, a flat, 68-year-old stomach that suddenly felt like a hollow, empty vessel. Grace, sitting opposite me, leaned forward, her face a mask of alarm. "Ellie, what is it?" I couldn't speak. I could only read. Robert's warped, protective logic filled the page, a testament to a love so profound and so misguided it had become monstrous. How could I, in that moment, place the weight of a child conceived in such violence upon your soul? It would not have been a blessing, Eleanor. It would have been a life sentence. A permanent, living anchor to the worst moment of your life, chaining you to the very memory I was trying to help you escape. "I made a vow to be your harbor," he wrote. "A harbor doesn't ask a ship if it wants to be saved from the storm. It simply provides the shelter. You were not capable of making such a choice then. So I made it for you. It was the greatest sin of my life, and I committed it in the name of love." The letter detailed how he had acted. He had conspired with my doctor. He had told me I needed a minor surgical procedure to deal with internal complications from the assault. I was sedated, and when I woke up, the complications were gone. But it wasn't a procedure, it was a birth, a secret birth. He had arranged for a closed adoption. He had found a good, loving couple, and he had placed our child, a son, into their arms before I ever knew he existed. The papers in my hands shook violently. That lost year, that foggy, medicated period of my life was not a blank space. It was a rewritten history. A history that had happened to my body, without my consent, without my knowledge. He hadn't just built a fortress around me, he had built a prison. I looked up from the page, my vision blurred, my entire past a lie. A child. I had a child. The word was an impossibility, a ghost that had just been given flesh by my husband's confession. This letter explained the original, secret wound, but it did not yet explain the will, the foundation, the money. With a sense of dread, I forced my eyes back to the page, knowing that the story of this unbearable betrayal was not yet over. My mind was still reeling from the revelation of a son, a ghost child I never knew, but Robert's steady, relentless script pulled me forward into the second half of his confession. He hadn't just made this decision 43 years ago. He had lived with its consequences every single day since. "I never stopped thinking about him, Eleanor," he wrote. "Out of a sense of guilt, of duty, I don't know what to call it. I kept track of him from a distance. I had to know he was safe. I hired a private investigator, just once, to learn the names of his adoptive parents. They were good people. They named him Michael. I saw a photograph of him when he was 10. He had your eyes. I felt a fresh wave of nausea. He had a name. He had my eyes. While I was living my quiet, orderly life, believing our world consisted of just the two of us, Robert was secretly tending to a ghost, watching a life that should have been ours unfold from the shadows. He knew when Michael graduated from college, when he got married, even the names of his 2 children, our grandchildren. The letter then explained the will. It was the endgame of his 43-year secret. As my health began to fail, He wrote, "I was faced with a terrible dilemma. I could not die and leave him with nothing. He is my blood, Eleanor. He is of you." To leave him unacknowledged, unprovided for, felt like a final, unforgivable sin. But to name him in my will would have been a brutal act. It would have exposed the secret in the coldest, most public way, and I could not do that to you. I could not let you learn of this from a lawyer's letter. I was still trying, even in my cowardice, to protect you. This was his final, twisted act of protection. He had to provide for the son, but he couldn't bear to tell me the truth. So, the historian, the meticulous planner, devised a solution. A labyrinth. The St. Jude's Children's Foundation was my answer, the letter continued. I chose the name because St. Jude is the patron saint of lost causes. A final, bitter academic joke, I suppose. It is a legal shell, nothing more. A vehicle to move our assets from one life to another without connecting them. And then he explained the most hurtful piece of the puzzle, his choice of accomplice. I had to choose a director I knew would be loyal, but more importantly, a man who would never ask questions. David was the only choice. He owed me everything, and his own life was such a mess that he was immune to the scrutiny that would fall on a more respectable man. His very unreliability made him the perfect, unquestioning keeper of an impossible secret. It was a terrible burden to place on him, but one he accepted out of love for his brother. The final paragraphs laid out the cold mechanics of his plan. The will would transfer our entire estate to the foundation. David's sole legal duty, as its director, would then be to immediately dissolve the foundation and transfer its total assets to a single, predetermined beneficiary named in the foundation's private charter. That beneficiary was Michael. It was a clean, legal, and utterly anonymous transfer of wealth. Robert had sacrificed my entire future on the altar of his own guilt. As I finished the last page, the full scope of the betrayal finally settled. The fortress he had built for me was never meant to keep the world out. It was meant to keep me in. The safe harbor wasn't a place of security, it was a place of ignorance. His final act wasn't just leaving me, it was a controlled demolition of the entire world he had built around me, designed to go off after he was safely in the grave. The letter ended. The story was told. My husband hadn't been a thief or an adulterer. He had been a man so consumed by his own fear and a twisted sense of love that he had committed the ultimate act of control. He had tried to write the final chapter of my life, and my son's life, for me. But as I carefully folded the pages and placed them back in the envelope, a new, quiet resolve took root in the ruins of my heart. Robert's story was finished, mine was not. And my story required a new character, the son I never knew I had. Robert's story was finished. He had written his final, secret chapter and sealed it in a tomb of granite and steel. But as I sat there in that cold, sterile viewing room, I realized that mine was not. For the first time in 43 years, a path forward was being dictated not by my fear, not by a need for safety, not by Robert's gentle guidance, but by a deep, primal need of my own. A need to reclaim the most important story a person has, the story of their own life. Grace finally broke the silence, her voice soft with a profound protective worry. "Ellie, what are you going to do? Are you sure you want to open this door?" Robert did a monstrous, unforgivable thing, but maybe he was right about the pain. Seeing this man, your son, are you prepared for what that might do to you? I listened to her, and I understood her fear because it had been my own for so long. But something fundamental had shifted within me. The fortress walls had not just been breached, they had been razed to the ground. There was nothing left to hide behind. "For my entire adult life," I said, my voice quiet but clear, "other people have been making decisions for me. The man who attacked me decided to violate my life. Then Robert, in his own way, decided how I would heal from it. He decided I was too fragile to know the truth about my own body. He decided to write a chapter of my life and then lock it away. Now his ghost, through a will, is deciding that I should be homeless. David is deciding I should accept it. Everyone is still trying to write my story." I looked at Grace, my oldest friend, and she saw a resolve in my eyes that she hadn't seen in decades. "This is the first decision that will be entirely my own. It's not about forgiving Robert. It's not even about the money anymore. It's about agency. And it's about him," I continued, a new, strange ache in my chest. He's not a secret anymore, Grace. He's a 42-year-old man. Michael. He has a wife. He has children. He has lived his entire life with a question mark at the very beginning of his story. He has a right to know the truth of where he came from. This isn't just about my past anymore. It's about his. The path was clear. My revenge would not be an act of destruction, but an act of creation. I would create a truth where there had only been lies. My first step was not to fight the will, but to fulfill its deepest unspoken purpose. I had to go back to the unwilling keeper of the secret. We left the bank, the heavy envelope now in my purse, a tangible piece of my rewritten history. "Take me to David's apartment," I told Grace. There was no hesitation in my voice. The second confrontation with my brother-in-law was nothing like the first. There were no accusations, no rage. I walked into his cluttered apartment and found him pacing, looking as though he hadn't slept in days. He saw my face and knew instantly that I had found the truth. "The safe deposit box," he whispered, his face crumbling with a mixture of terror and, beneath it, a profound and weary relief. "I know everything, David," I said calmly. "I've read the letter." The dam of his 43-year-old promise finally broke. He sank onto his worn-out sofa and began to sob, not the theatrical tears of a liar, but the ragged, soul-deep sobs of a man releasing a burden he was never strong enough to carry. "I'm so sorry, Ellie," he wept into his hands. "I told him it was wrong. I begged him to tell you." I looked at the broken man in front of me, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, just a singular, unshakable purpose. "If you are truly sorry," I said, my voice as steady and unforgiving as a surgeon's scalpel, "you will give me his phone number. You will tell me his last known address. You will help me arrange a meeting. Robert may have started this story, but I am going to be the one who finishes it." True to his word, a relieved and guilt-ridden David did exactly as I asked. He became my unwilling but compliant go-between. The story he told Michael was a carefully constructed half-truth. A distant, scholarly relative named Robert Vance had passed away, and his will involved a private foundation set up to benefit certain families. Robert's widow, he explained, needed to meet with him to discuss the details of the bequest. Michael, understandably confused but intrigued, agreed. A meeting was set for the following Saturday at a quiet coffee shop in a neighborhood halfway between our two lives. The week leading up to that meeting was the longest of my life. The 90-day eviction notice, the anger at Robert, the financial uncertainty, all of it faded into the background, replaced by a singular, terrifying, and profoundly hopeful focus. What does a mother wear to meet the 42-year-old son she never knew she had? I must have tried on every outfit in my closet, seeking a balance between a respectable widow and, what? A stranger? A ghost? In the end, I chose a simple blue dress, the color of a calm sea. Grace drove me, her presence a silent, solid anchor. We sat at a small table in the corner of the cafe, the air filled with the scent of roasted coffee and the low murmur of conversations. Every time the bell above the door chimed, my heart leaped into my throat. I was about to meet a living piece of my own history, a walking, talking embodiment of the secret that had defined and deformed my entire adult life. Then he walked in. He was tall, like Robert, with the same thoughtful brow of a man who spends his time thinking. He scanned the room, a slightly lost look on his face, and then his eyes met mine. And I forgot how to breathe. Robert's letter was right. They were my eyes, the same shape, the same shade of hazelnut, looking back at me from a stranger's face. He approached the table cautiously. "Mrs. Vance?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Please, call me Eleanor," I said, my own voice sounding distant. He was a good man. I could see it instantly. There was a kindness in his smile, a quiet humility in his posture. He spoke about his life with a simple, unpretentious sincerity. He was an architect. He was married. He had 2 daughters, ages 8 and 10. My granddaughters. I listened as he spoke, but my mind was a whirlwind, cataloging every detail. The way he gestured with his hands, a trait that was entirely his own, the way he tilted his head when he listened, exactly like Robert used to do. He was a mosaic of 2 people he had never known, a stranger who was more familiar to me than anyone on earth. Our conversation was a masterpiece of polite fiction. I was the widow of a philanthropist, he was the surprised beneficiary. I explained that my husband, the historian, had a private passion for correcting small historical injustices, and that his adoptive family line was one Robert had taken a scholarly interest in. The lie felt flimsy and absurd, but he was too polite to question it. For an hour, I performed the role of a kind, elderly benefactress, while every cell in my body screamed the truth. I am your mother. The story of your life began in me. You have my eyes. The questions I wanted to ask, are you happy? Are you loved? Did you have a good life? Were buried under the sterile inquiries about trusts and estates. After an hour, he checked his watch and apologized. He had to leave. His youngest daughter, my granddaughter Sophie, had a soccer game. He stood up to shake my hand, his grip warm and firm. Can we meet again next week? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. There are some more personal details of the estate that I need to discuss with you in a more private setting, perhaps at my home. He agreed, a look of kind curiosity on his face. I watched him walk out of the cafe and disappear into the bustling Saturday afternoon, and I knew, with absolute certainty, what I had to do. The next time we met, I would not be a representative of his father's estate. I would be his mother, and I would finally tell him the true, painful, and complete story of how his life began. The following Saturday, as promised, Michael came to my home. He walked through the front door of the house on Chestnut Lane and into the living room that Robert had so carefully designed to be my sanctuary from the world. He looked around with a polite, architectural curiosity at the bookshelves his father had built and the bay window his mother had loved. And as he stood there, a man with my eyes in the heart of my fortress, I knew there could be no more performances and no more lies. I didn't offer him coffee. I didn't engage in small talk. I simply gestured to the armchair opposite mine. On the small table between us, I had placed the thick, cream-colored envelope. Michael, I began, my voice clear and steady. The story I told you about my husband's estate was a fiction. The truth is far more complicated. The reason Robert left his entire estate to you is not because of a historical curiosity. It is because he was your father. The shock on his face was profound. It was a slow, dawning horror that washed away his polite smile. He started to speak, to protest, but I held up a hand. Please, I said, let me finish. This is the story of how your life began. And so I told him. I told him about the woman I was before, about the attack that had shattered her, and about the deep, disorienting fog of the year that followed. Then, with a voice that did not tremble, I told him of the secret pregnancy and of the unilateral decision made by a loving, terrified husband who believed he was protecting his fragile wife from a truth that would destroy her. I told him that his conception was the result of an act of violence, but his birth was the result of an act of misguided love. He sat there, utterly still, his face pale. The entire foundation of his identity, the narrative of his life that he had understood for 42 years, had been demolished in the space of 5 minutes. He was not the cherished, chosen child of the wonderful parents who had raised him. He was a secret. When I finished, I pushed the envelope across the table. This is a letter he left for me, I said softly. But I believe it belongs to you as much as it does to me. It will explain his reasons. It will let you hear his voice. He took the letter with a trembling hand and began to read. And as I watched my son read the final confession of my husband, a strange and painful shift happened within me. For weeks I had seen Robert's act as a cold, controlling betrayal. But watching Michael's face, seeing the confusion, the pain, and the dawning understanding, I finally saw the story from Robert's perspective. I saw the terrified young husband, trapped in an impossible dilemma, making a choice he thought was the only way to save the woman he loved. I saw the 43 years of his silent guilt, his secret obsession, his lonely burden. The anger I had held onto so tightly finally dissolved, replaced by a profound, aching sorrow for all three of us, for the lives we had lost, and for the man who had broken his own heart trying to mend mine. The villain was gone. All that was left was a tragic, deeply flawed man who had loved me too much and too fearfully. The collapse was not of a man but of a lie. The satisfaction was not the sweet taste of revenge, but the bitter, cleansing taste of the truth. Robert's attempt to control our stories from the grave had failed. In his desperate effort to keep us apart, his will had become the very instrument that brought us together. Michael finished the letter and slowly folded the pages. He looked up, his eyes, my eyes filled with a universe of unasked questions. He was silent for a long time. Then he asked the first one. "Did you," he started, his voice thick with emotion, "did you ever have a name for me?" Robert believed he was protecting the woman he loved by making an impossible choice for her. If you were in his shoes, knowing the trauma she had endured, would you have told her the truth about the pregnancy? Or would you have done what he did, believing you were saving her from more pain? There is no easy answer. Share your choice in the comments below. The will and the money suddenly seemed like trivial, meaningless details. In the quiet of that living room, a 42-year-old secret was finally laid to rest, and a fragile, uncertain but honest future was just beginning to be born. The 90-day eviction notice is still on my mantelpiece, but it no longer holds any power. After our first meeting, Michael and I decided to handle the will together. We hired a new lawyer, and with David's full and willing cooperation, we are in the process of dissolving the foundation. The house on Chestnut Lane will be sold, an act that feels less like an eviction and more like a necessary release of the past. The proceeds, we have agreed, will be placed in a trust for my granddaughter's education. The money, it turns out, was never the point. It was only the key that unlocked the story. I no longer think of Robert as a stranger or a monster. I think of him as the flawed, brilliant, and fearful man he was. His love for me was the truest thing in my life, and his betrayal of me was its equal and opposite truth. I have come to understand that he built me a fortress not to imprison me, but because he himself was a prisoner of his own fear of my pain, fear of the truth, fear of his own inability to fix the one thing that was truly broken. His final act was not one of cruelty, but one of profound, tragic cowardice. I don't know if I have forgiven him, but I have begun to understand him. My relationship with Michael is a quiet, tentative thing. We are two strangers learning the grammar of a shared history. He comes over for coffee every Sunday. He tells me about his work, about his wife. Last week he brought his daughters with him. I watched my 10-year-old granddaughter, Sophie, who has my smile, tracing the patterns on the Persian rug in my living room, and I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any I had known in my fortress. It was a fragile peace, a complicated one, but it was real. Robert's greatest secret has become my greatest, most unexpected gift. My legacy is no longer a story of survival. It is a story of connection.